The phone rang just as I was pouring my morning coffee, the rich aroma of the beans filling the kitchen. I glanced at the caller ID, Aurelia. My heart tightened for a fraction of a second before my composure returned. Aurelia Devereaux. My daughter's clever but calculating wife rarely called without purpose, and I had learned long ago to listen carefully. "Hello, Aurelia," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Rosie, hi. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." She chirped, her voice laced with that practiced warmth I had grown to recognize. "Linnea and I, along with my parents, are hosting a small dinner tomorrow evening. Very intimate, just family. We'd love for you to come." I sipped my coffee, letting her words settle. A family dinner seemed harmless enough, but something in her cadence set off a warning bell. There was a subtle pause before she continued, a slight hesitation that told me this was no ordinary invitation. "Of course I'd be delighted," I replied carefully. "What time should I arrive?" 7:30 Lake Otsego, she said. "Dress formally. My parents are very traditional, and they appreciate quiet dignity." I set my cup down, letting her words linger. Quiet dignity. The phrase sounded innocuous, but I had lived in France for 5 years, built businesses in Bordeaux and Marseille, and navigated rooms full of people who prided themselves on refinement and subtle power. I knew the type. Every compliment, a test, every courtesy, a measure of weakness or strength. As she rattled on about wine selections and menu options, I felt a familiar surge of awareness. This dinner was carefully orchestrated, a stage set with invisible rules that I was only beginning to read. I allowed a smile to curl across my lips. I had seen this before. People underestimating me, assuming experience meant submission. Assuming age meant vulnerability. They would learn eventually that patience, observation, and timing could carry more weight than words. Halfway through the call, an unspoken realization crept in. Aurelia's insistence on tradition, her mention of her parents' preferences, the careful framing of the dinner, it was not merely a gathering. There was a subtle agenda beneath the surface, an attempt to guide Linnea to exert influence over family decisions, and perhaps, though she did not know it, over me. A quiet manipulation aimed at securing advantage, at testing boundaries, at exploring cracks in the walls I had built around my estate. I let the silence stretch for a moment, as if considering. Then I responded with deliberate warmth. "Thank you for the invitation, Aurelia. I will be there. I look forward to seeing all of you." Her voice brightened on the other end, unaware that I had already begun tracing the threads of her plan, mapping potential vulnerabilities. She had imagined control. She had imagined a simple, compliant grandmother-in-law who would nod and smile, not realizing that experience had honed instincts sharper than any glance or whisper. After hanging up, I stood at the kitchen window, letting the morning sun filter through the maples I had planted decades ago. The leaves trembled gently in the breeze, and for a moment, I allowed myself a private smile. Aurelia and her parents were confident, carefully rehearsed in their charm, yet oblivious to the fact that every subtle move they made had been recorded, every nuance cataloged, and every intent anticipated. I poured a second cup of coffee, the warmth steady in my hands. This dinner would not be ordinary. It would be a test of wit, patience, and presence, and I intended to meet it fully prepared, quietly, deliberately, and on my own terms. With the phone call ended and the coffee finished, I turned toward my study. There were notes to review, memories to recall, and strategies to begin drafting. The day ahead was set, and so was the stage for what would unfold tomorrow evening. Next, I began tracing the contours of the plan that would allow me to navigate their ambitions while safeguarding everything that mattered most. As I sat back in my study chair, the echoes of Aurelia's voice lingered like a delicate perfume, sweet on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent I had learned to recognize over the years. I began running through the past months, recalling each carefully worded comment, every thinly veiled compliment that masked critique and the subtle competitions she had orchestrated. The way she compared my ideas to her own in front of Linnea, the quiet corrections, the moments when she shifted attention away from me as if I were already invisible. It was all intentional, and it all pointed toward a pattern I had seen before, a slow, quiet encroachment disguised as familial charm. I pored over mental notes, the small manipulations lining up like dominoes. The way she chose seating arrangements at previous gatherings, positioning herself strategically between Linnea and me. The way her laughter often cut at the edges of my presence-testing responses. Even her compliments carried a careful weight, the sort that demanded reciprocity, subtly binding her family's perceptions. And then there were her parents, Henri and Solange. I recalled our brief encounter at Linnea and Aurelia's wedding, their silvered elegance and meticulous composure. They had not truly met me in any meaningful sense, but their eyes had measured me, had calculated what I could or could not do. I realized now that they too had underestimated me, not deliberately perhaps, but through the assumption that age and distance equaled naivety. They had presumed that an American grandmother with a polite French accent and a collection of European anecdotes would be easy to charm or sway. A small smile touched my lips as I allowed that thought to linger. They believed I was unaware of subtleties in business strategy, of hidden alliances, of leverage points, carefully hidden in contracts and investments. They believed I could be distracted by appearances misled by the social theater they so meticulously rehearsed. I let my mind wander to the upcoming dinner, imagining the space between the silverware, the glint of candlelight on crystal, the unspoken games they would play. It was more than social. It was a psychological test, a probing exercise to see if I could be outmaneuvered, if my authority over my own household and my relationship with Linnea could be quietly eroded. I thought of the French lessons I had taken as a young woman, the business negotiations in Bordeaux and Marseille, the long afternoons reading contracts with a magnifying glass, learning the ways words could be traps or shields. I understood now that what was about to unfold was designed to see if I would remain passive, to gauge how much I would tolerate before responding. The thought both amused and intrigued me. I would attend this dinner not merely as a guest, but as a quiet observer, a strategist, tracing every intention and testing each move before making one of my own. If they believed I could not see through them, if they assumed their carefully laid traps would go unnoticed, they were in for a lesson that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with patience, preparation, and precision. Rising from my chair, I moved to the window, watching the morning light catch on the leaves of the maple I had planted for Linnea when she was a girl. The stage was being set. All that remained was for the players to arrive unaware that the game had already begun. With that certainty in mind, I returned to my desk, pulling out a fresh notebook and fountain pen to begin cataloging past interactions, small clues, and opportunities. The first notes were already forming the foundation for a plan that would carry through the evening and beyond. The drive through Lake Otsego was quiet. The streets lined with homes that could have been pulled from a magazine, spread uniform lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and facades that whispered wealth without admitting to the effort beneath. I let my eyes roam, taking note of each detail. The meticulous gardens, the glint of wrought iron gates, the subtle messages of prosperity, masquerading as casual taste. Everything about this neighborhood was designed to impress, to measure, to compare. When I reached Aurelia and Linnea's house, I parked at the end of the long driveway and took a moment to steady myself. The exterior of the home gleamed in the late afternoon sun, white stone and dark shutters forming a facade that spoke of refinement and control. I stepped out of the car, adjusted my scarf, and walked up the stone path. The crunch of gravel underfoot, a gentle counterpoint to the racing thoughts in my mind. Linnea opened the door before I could even reach the knocker. Her smile was warm, effortless, the daughter I had raised shining through the woman she had become. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said, wrapping me in a gentle hug. I returned it, letting the gesture feel natural, even as my senses remained alert to the undercurrents I had anticipated. Inside the living room exuded calculated elegance. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, catching the light in 1,000 miniature rainbows. Polished silver gleamed on tables set with care, and the scent of fresh flowers drifted from arrangements placed with exacting precision. Aurelia stood nearby, poised in her usual self-assured way, her smile just shy of cordial, her eyes surveying me with a faint edge of amusement. Henri and Solange were already seated in the parlor, their posture perfect, their expressions polite yet measuring. Every glance, every tilt of the head spoke volumes to those trained to observe. Rosie Aurelia said, smoothly stepping forward, "So glad you could join us. This is going to be very special." There was a practiced warmth in her tone, but beneath it a flicker of subtle judgment, as if she were testing how I would receive her careful theatrics. I smiled and nodded, aware that every gesture was being noted, catalogued. The dining room was set with the same meticulous care I had noticed throughout the house. The table gleamed under the chandelier crystal glasses, catching the last light of day silverware, aligned with almost obsessive precision. Each place setting suggested order control and an expectation of performance. Wine awaited in decanters, their labels visible enough to display the lineage of choice without conversation. I allowed my eyes to sweep over it all, noting the subtle cues, the way the napkins were folded, the precise angle of the chairs, the slight tilt of a centerpiece that seemed to direct attention subtly toward Aurelia and her parents. As we moved toward our seats, Aurelia offered small, well-timed compliments. "I thought you might enjoy this," she said, gesturing toward a glass of wine. I acknowledged it with a nod, noting the subtle microaggressions tucked between the lines, the insinuations, the carefully masked superiority, the way they assumed I would accept, without comment. Each observation added to the pattern I had been tracing in my mind for days. Henri's eyes flicked toward my hands as I settled in, and Solange's smile was just a fraction too tight. I recognized the small measures of dominance, the probing, that came not with words, but with subtle presence. And I sat poised, calm, letting it all wash over me, recording each motion, each glance, each almost imperceptible shift. I lifted my wine glass and took a measured sip, letting the aroma and flavor register, while my mind continued its quiet survey of the room. Every piece, every gesture, every calculated placement would inform the decisions to come. The stage was set. Every eye in the room was observing, and I was ready to respond, not impulsively, but deliberately. With the table settled and the initial pleasantries exchanged, I turned my attention to the first course, ready to navigate the intricate currents of this gathering as the evening unfolded. The first course arrived a delicate blend of roasted vegetables and a light consommé, and with it, the subtle shift in the room that I had anticipated. Aurelia leaned slightly toward her parents, speaking in soft, fluid French, the words carrying a melody meant to charm, but threaded with something sharper. Tiny barbs hidden in cadence and tone. My ears caught every syllable. Age, irrelevance, and wealth were the recurring themes, delivered with a practiced precision that assumed my ignorance. Henri's voice was low, deliberate. "Elle pense encore qu'elle peut comprendre le monde des affaires," he murmured, his silvered eyes glinting with amusement. She still thinks she can grasp the business world. Solange added a small, tight laugh, brushing her fingers over the crystal glass as she tilted it, the gesture casual but laden with meaning. Et cette fortune, tellement fragile, prête à s'effondrer. And that fortune, so fragile, ready to crumble. Aurelia's lips curved into the faintest of smirks, leaning back as if the very air around me belonged to her performance. Grand-mère est charmante, mais un peu dépassée, she whispered. Grandmother is charming, but somewhat outdated. I noted the rhythm of her words, the careful insertion of diminutives meant to diminish. I sat still, hands folded gently in my lap, taking a small sip of the wine they had so meticulously chosen. To the untrained eye, I appeared calm, polite, even slightly distracted by the meal. In truth, I catalogued everything: their tone, their posture, the way Aurelia's eyes flicked to Linnea after each comment, testing for a reaction, for validation. They assumed I could not follow, could not translate, could not infer the subtle power dynamics at play. Mini twist. Aurelia's smirk widened when she caught my gaze for the briefest instant, assuming the silence confirmed her superiority. She did not realize that every word, every inflection had been etched into my mind, stored not as an insult, but as intelligence, as data to be leveraged. The assumptions she made about my comprehension, about my detachment, revealed her own weaknesses: overconfidence, impatience, and the underestimation of experience. I let the conversation drift on, pretending to admire the arrangement of the salad, offering a nod here, a polite smile there. Linnea, caught between us, chatted lightly about work, unaware of the undercurrent flowing beneath the table. She did not yet see the calculation behind my calm demeanor, the strategy forming silently in my mind. The dinner continued with Aurelia and her parents, speaking more freely in French, each sentence a test, a probe, to measure my reactions, to see if I would break composure, if I would challenge their subtle hierarchy. Each comment was a question, each glance a probe, and I responded with silence, letting the weight of my observation accumulate. I considered the irony. These were people who believed that mastery of language, of etiquette, of subtle manipulation could substitute for depth of understanding and foresight. They were operating under the false assumption that arrogance could pass for intelligence and charm for strategy. I had spent decades navigating rooms like this, rooms where every advantage could be concealed in words and every liability hidden in plain sight. I lifted my fork with deliberate calm, allowing the aroma and texture of the dish to anchor me as if the act of eating were my only concern. But my mind was busy calculating, cataloging, preparing for the moment when observation would turn into action, when patience would crystallize into leverage. By the time the main course arrived, I had already noted patterns, identified vulnerabilities, and traced the faint outlines of opportunity woven through their confidence. Aurelia's tiny gestures, the way Henri adjusted his cuff, Solange's eyes flicking toward the chandelier, all were pieces in a game I intended to play. Quietly, carefully, and on my own terms. The first half of the evening ended with laughter and polite conversation. But beneath it all, the real dialogue had already begun. I had heard their words, understood their meanings, and prepared the board on which I would make my move. As dessert was cleared from the table, I let a final neutral smile linger on my face, the room still unaware that my comprehension had turned every slight into a silent ledger, every insult into potential leverage ready for the moments to come. The evening's polite applause and soft chatter lingered in my mind long after I returned home. I placed my coat carefully on the rack and moved toward my study, letting the door click shut behind me. The veneer of civility at the dinner had been flawless, but beneath it, I had seen the same patterns I had encountered in boardrooms from Bordeaux to Paris: ambition wrapped in charm power, disguised as etiquette, and underestimation, disguised as courtesy. I sank into my chair and let my thoughts drift to the vineyards of France, to the contracts I had navigated with careful precision, to the negotiations that could have toppled empires if mishandled. Experience had taught me that patience and observation were more potent than force, and that leverage, when applied at the right moment, could transform a subtle advantage into decisive power. Those lessons were not abstract. They were practical, honed through years of attention to detail, of noticing what others assumed was irrelevant. As I traced the evening in my mind, each word spoken by Aurelia and her parents unfolded again. Every compliment, every quiet jab, every glance that sought validation, all of it could be cataloged and turned to my advantage. Their confidence in their own superiority, their assumption that I could not follow the subtleties of French, had revealed more than arrogance. It had revealed opportunity. I opened a notebook and began mapping what I would later call a strategy ledger, jotting down their actions, the microaggressions and the faint signs of overconfidence. In one column, I noted Aurelia's habitual reliance on charm to manipulate Linnea. In another, I listed the subtle cues from Henri and Solange that suggested they were financially and operationally naive in their vineyard holdings. The ledger was already forming the foundation of a plan that would not require confrontation, but quiet, effective action. The mini-twist revealed itself almost immediately. As I traced through the public and private filings of the Devereux vineyard, I saw a gap, a vulnerability in their financing structure, a minority stake that could be quietly acquired, a timing issue in their bridge notes that no one seemed to monitor. It was not a flaw they had overlooked in arrogance. It was an oversight born from assumption, from the belief that their family's wealth insulated them from scrutiny. That same assumption was the kind that could allow someone like me, underestimated and ignored, to intervene subtly and decisively. I smiled faintly as I sipped my tea. The irony was not lost on me. They believed they were the architects of the evening, the arbiters of social grace and familial influence, yet they had handed me the keys to maneuver without resistance. The plan at its core would require patience and precision. I would act quietly and visibly until the moment when every observation, every note in my ledger would converge into an outcome that could not be ignored. I began sketching the first contours of the strategy initial quiet inquiries, creating an American entity as a vehicle for investment timing, the approach to coincide with a capital movement that would naturally favor my entry, and preparing the family for an arrival that would appear ordinary, but carry consequences they could not anticipate. Each step was carefully considered, each potential misstep accounted for. By the time I set down my pen, a clear path had begun to take shape, a blueprint for turning their underestimation into leverage. The evening had been more than a test of composure. It had been an audition for strategy, and I had passed without their knowledge. Rising from my chair, I looked out the window at the fading light over Portland, thinking of Linnea, thinking of the stage that had been set. Tomorrow, the plan would continue to unfold, guided by careful observation and meticulous preparation, as the first steps of the seed I had planted took root. The following evening, I arrived early, before any of the guests to settle into the rhythm of the house, unnoticed. I allowed the space to speak to me, letting my eyes roam over the polished floors, the careful placement of chairs, the subtle angles of the furniture that directed attention and suggested hierarchy. Every detail mattered, from the tilt of the chandelier above to the light spilling across the silverware. The room itself was a participant in the game, and I intended to understand its role fully before anyone else arrived. When Aurelia and Linnea entered, I watched the subtle exchanges that were invisible to all but the most observant. Aurelia's hand lingered near Linnea's, as if to assert control, a casual touch that carried intent. Her smile, measured and precise, was designed to convey warmth while masking dominance. I noticed how Linnea responded. She returned the smile, but there was a fleeting hesitation in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible pressure. Henri and Solange arrived shortly after their entrance, calculated and poised. Henri's posture carried the quiet arrogance of someone accustomed to authority, and Solange's eyes flicked constantly, scanning the room for lapses in etiquette gaps, in attention, anything to correct or influence. I observed how their glances intersected with Aurelia's movements, how alliances formed in microseconds, conveyed by the tilt of a head, the lift of an eyebrow, a barely audible murmur in French. As dinner progressed, I catalogued the patterns carefully. Aurelia orchestrated the flow of conversation, subtly steering Linnea toward her perspectives, inserting opinions that guided decisions without appearing directive. I noted how she assessed my reactions, assuming my silence indicated ignorance or deference. That assumption would become a critical element of the strategy I had begun to outline. Henri interjected at intervals, offering remarks on wine and culinary choices that were less about appreciation and more about establishing superiority. Solange commented lightly on manners, each phrase carefully layered with critique hidden beneath civility. They believed these subtleties were invisible to me, but I traced each nuance, connecting them into a map of intentions and priorities. Aurelia's overconfidence became apparent in the repetition of certain gestures, how she leaned slightly forward when she perceived Linnea's agreement, how she laughed a fraction of a second before the rest of the table to suggest leadership. It was a pattern I recorded mentally, noting the hierarchy she assumed and the points where it might be most vulnerable. I allowed my own presence to remain understated. A measured sip of wine, a slight nod, a gentle laugh at the right moment. Each action was deliberate, designed not to draw attention while absorbing the dynamics of the room. Every whisper in French, every subtle glance was a data point, a clue to motivations, alliances, and weaknesses. By the time the main course arrived, the map in my mind was becoming detailed. I had identified the subtle pressures exerted on Linnea, the invisible maneuvers Aurelia used to assert dominance, and the ways her parents reinforced those maneuvers with an air of traditional authority. I understood their rhythm, their assumptions, and most importantly, the blind spots they had exposed in their own choreography. As dessert was brought out and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, I continued to observe with the same careful attention, cataloging movements, words, and reactions. The room had spoken volumes, and I had listened without interruption. Returning home later that night, I carried the observations with me like carefully labeled specimens. Each gesture, each whispered phrase, each moment of assumed superiority became a building block in the strategy I was assembling. The foundation had been laid. Now it was a matter of timing, of patience, and of knowing precisely when to convert observation into action. I opened my notebook and began transferring the evening's lessons to paper, connecting behaviors, with intentions tracing the invisible lines of influence and control. Tomorrow, the next phase would unfold, guided by the quiet power of preparation. Back in the quiet of my study, I closed the door and settled at my desk. The house felt like it exhaled behind me, leaving only the soft ticking of the clock and the hum of the evening outside. I reached for a fresh notebook and a fountain pen, the ink dark and ready, and began the meticulous work I had started forming in my mind over the past 2 dinners. Each slight, each whispered jab, each glance that had carried judgment or manipulation. I recorded them all in both English and French, the languages that had shaped my experience and sharpened my perception. It was not an exercise in bitterness. It was a method, a ledger of dignity. Each line became a piece of evidence, a reminder of intention, a measure of character. I reflected on the ethics of it all, weighing the impulse for immediate reaction against the power of patience. Revenge, I reminded myself, had a bluntness that often destroyed more than it restored. Justice, on the other hand, required precision, foresight, and timing. It was the difference between swinging a sword blindly and placing each move on a chessboard with care. I began organizing the ledger into categories: verbal jabs, manipulations toward Linnea, assertions of superiority by Aurelia's parents, and patterns of overconfidence. Each item became a data point, each repetition a trend. The act of writing slowed my thoughts and clarified my purpose. I could see with chilling clarity the pathways that led to opportunity, and the points where the Devereux family's assumptions had left them exposed. As I traced through the evening's exchanges, a mini twist presented itself: a subtle irregularity in the Devereux Vineyard holdings. A clause in a bridge note they had relied on for capital expansion had been drafted in such a way that it left a minority stake vulnerable to acquisition under specific conditions. It was not an oversight they would likely recognize, and it could become the keystone of my plan if handled with care. I noted the section in my ledger, marking it for later verification and potential action. The more I wrote, the more the ledger transformed from a record of indignities into a blueprint for measured influence. It was a tool that would allow me to act decisively, without shouting, without confrontation, and without risking my position with Linnea. Every insult became a reminder, every glance a piece of strategy, and every assumption they had made about my awareness became leverage I could wield quietly. I paused to sip tea and review the notes I had assembled. The ledger was more than a record. It was a framework for action, a bridge from observation to execution. I thought of Aurelia's confidence, Henri's subtle arrogance, and Solange's meticulous control, and I allowed a small smile. They believed themselves untouchable, their movements invisible, their influence absolute. They had underestimated the discipline of experience, the weight of observation, and the quiet power that comes from understanding the rules of engagement before the game begins. I spent hours cataloging, cross-referencing, and annotating each line, reinforcing the architecture of what I intended to do. By the time the night deepened, I had a ledger that did not merely recount events. It held the blueprint for reclaiming balance and asserting authority in a way that could not be questioned. Laying the pen down, I leaned back and regarded the ledger with satisfaction. It was ready, each slight, each manipulation, each underestimated move, noted, understood, and converted into potential influence. The pieces were in place, and the next steps would be guided by the clarity this exercise had provided. I closed the notebook and let my mind drift briefly over the next stage, envisioning the moments when observation would shift into action and when patience would reveal its full strength. Tomorrow, I would begin shaping that action quietly and deliberately. The next morning, I began translating the strategy from ledger to action. I opened my laptop, the familiar hum of the machine grounding me in purpose, and started drafting the legal documents for a U.S.-based entity I had decided to call Cascade Ridge Holdings, LLC. It would serve as the vehicle for the investment I intended to make in the Devereux Vineyard, a quiet, deliberate step that no one would anticipate. Each detail was precise: the paperwork, the registered address, the banking arrangements, all structured to appear ordinary, yet carry the full weight of potential leverage. Years of international business had taught me that power often lay in preparation and subtlety, in moving without announcing each motion. The less visible the action, the more effective it could be when revealed. I paused to review the ledger from the previous night. The notes on Henri's reliance on his French distributor, coupled with the timing of the vineyard's bridge note, suggested an opportunity. The distributor, a small entity, accustomed to handling large families' finances with deference rather than scrutiny, could unwittingly aid my plan simply by following protocol. A minor capital call, a scheduled transfer, or a small oversight in communication, all of these could allow Cascade Ridge to step in quietly, gaining influence without confrontation. I opened multiple tabs tracing the vineyard's legal filings, checking the timing of minority share movements, and reviewing the financial reports that had been accessible through public records and a few carefully placed professional contacts. Each document, each number, confirmed that the foundation I was building could be solid, discreet, and legally unassailable. The mini twist presented itself subtly. The distributor had a history of compliance that leaned toward automatic approval when instructions came from a registered entity. They had not been rigorous in challenging minor discrepancies, operating under the assumption that family-led decisions required no scrutiny. It was a vulnerability I could exploit without ever speaking a word, without confrontation, without revealing my hand. The irony was not lost on me. The very systems designed to protect the Devereaux family could be used to shift their assumptions and create leverage that they would never see coming. I set up the entity, formally establishing bank accounts, EIN registration, and corporate officers, all under my careful oversight. Every decision was calculated, designed to avoid detection, until the moment when the structure was fully operational. I reviewed potential exit strategies, contingencies, and minor adjustments in timing that could ensure smooth execution even if unforeseen complications arose. By mid-afternoon, Cascade Ridge Holdings was active in principle, though entirely invisible in practice. I leaned back in my chair and considered the sequence of steps that would follow: investment notification, capital call, conversion of minority interest, and subtle assertion of influence. None of it required a confrontation, yet each step built toward a shift in the balance of power that would be undeniable once revealed. I took a moment to reflect on the ethics of what I was undertaking. This was not revenge, nor was it personal malice. It was the application of knowledge, observation, and patience to correct an imbalance created by arrogance, underestimation, and subtle manipulation. It was the quiet assertion of justice, the kind that speaks louder than arguments, louder than raised voices, and certainly louder than the carefully rehearsed airs of superiority the Devereaux family had been practicing for years. As evening approached, I reviewed the steps again in my mind, cross-referencing them with the ledger of interactions, the cataloged behaviors, and the tiny, underestimated opportunities that had been exposed. Each note, each calculation, each minor twist fit neatly into the larger design. I closed the laptop with deliberate care, letting the quiet of the house remind me of the potency of patience. The foundation had been laid, the mechanisms set into motion, and the next phase would unfold with precision, guided by observation, strategy, and timing. Tomorrow, I would take the next step, moving from preparation into the first visible stage of action, confident that the quiet work I had done would shape the outcome without ever needing to raise a voice. I spent the morning in quiet rehearsal. Standing before the mirror, I adjusted the folds of my blouse, smoothing the fabric until it lay just so. Each cuff, each collar, each subtle hint of jewelry was chosen with intention, not to dazzle, but to project calm authority. I practiced gestures, the tilt of my head, the placement of my hands on the table, all designed to appear natural while maintaining absolute control over every nuance of expression. Conversation, I reminded myself, was a game of timing and inference. I rehearsed responses to likely questions, neutral statements that could convey knowledge without revealing the scope of my understanding. I imagined the room, the tension hidden behind smiles, the tiny sparks of judgment that Aurelia and her parents would inevitably project. I would meet them with composure, allowing their assumptions to guide their own missteps, while I remained the quiet observer. In the background, I reviewed the ledger of prior interactions. Each minor slight, each whispered critique, each overconfidence of Aurelia had been catalogued and transformed into intelligence. My observations were not static. They would inform every inflection, every pause, every carefully measured revelation. I was preparing to enter the dinner, not as the woman they expected, but as a presence that carried weight quietly, inevitably, and deliberately. The identity I had chosen for the formal dinner, Françoise Moreau, was not just a name. It was a mantle of authority, a subtle assertion of competence and strategic foresight. I would present myself as a partner with a stake in the vineyard's expansion, someone whose involvement was both legitimate and consequential, yet whose true reach remained invisible until the moment it mattered. Every letter, every reservation, every note had been prepared in alignment with this persona, designed to unsettle without confrontation, to shift assumptions without a word spoken. As the afternoon unfolded, a minor but revealing twist reached me. A carefully worded message from Aurelia's assistant, delivered under the guise of casual coordination, suggested they were aware that something unusual might be underway. They were attempting subtly to send a warning, perhaps, to recalibrate their strategies or anticipate my moves. Yet they had underestimated the quiet depth of preparation. I had anticipated exactly this type of interference and incorporated contingencies that ensured their signal could not affect my plan. Their awareness, rather than disrupting me, only reinforced the inevitability of the next phase. I moved to the kitchen and prepared a light snack, the methodical chopping of fruit and arranging of plates, a meditative exercise. Each motion reminded me that preparation was as much physical as it was mental. Confidence required repetition, and calm required discipline. The ledger, the rehearsals, the meticulous attention to detail had become the framework upon which I would operate, guiding every step of the evening to come. By the time evening settled over Portland, I was ready. My appearance, my demeanor, and my understanding of every micro moment that could arise were aligned. I carried with me the awareness that the dinner would be more than a social engagement. It would be a stage one in which patience, precision, and the careful orchestration of perception would determine the balance of power. I took a final glance at the notes I had prepared, reviewing the flow of introductions, the seating arrangements, the cues that would guide conversation, and the subtle inflections that would signal authority without a raised voice. Everything was accounted for. With a steady breath, I donned my coat and picked up the documents that would accompany me as Françoise Moreau. The path I had mapped was ready to transition from observation to action. And the next stage, the dinner where all the preparation would meet reality, was moments away. I spent the morning preparing the final piece of the puzzle. A crisp envelope rested on my desk, its contents carefully, crafted a formal letter addressed to Henri and Solange Devereaux, signed under the name Françoise Moreau, partner at Cascade Ridge Holdings. Inside, I outlined a discreet but substantial interest in the vineyard, framed with the utmost professionalism, emphasizing strategic alignment and opportunity rather than authority or interference. The wording was precise, designed to convey weight without intimidation. I wanted them to understand that a capable and serious partner had entered the equation, someone who could influence decisions quietly, legally, and effectively. There was no room for ambiguity. The letter had to speak with clarity and credibility, carrying authority in ink rather than in voice. I paused before sealing the envelope, considering the subtle dynamics at play. Aurelia had been confident, assured in her mastery over the family stage, unaware that this single sheet of paper would quietly shift the axis. Her parents, poised and controlled, would receive it without recognizing its potential significance. Every assumption they held about my presence, my influence, and my patience would be challenged without confrontation. The mini twist was in the simplicity of the act. The Devereaux parents would read the words and note them politely, perhaps curious but unalarmed. Aurelia, meanwhile, would continue her calculated efforts, entirely unaware that the balance of power had begun to tilt. The letter's quiet authority would set the stage for the upcoming dinner, giving me the advantage of observation and preparedness, while they remained confident in their assumptions. I arranged for a courier to deliver the envelope with discretion, ensuring it would arrive the same day, but without fanfare. Timing was crucial. It had to precede the second dinner just enough to allow the seed of consideration to take root without altering their rehearsed interactions too early. I watched the package leave my office, imagining it crossing state lines, entering their household, and resting on their polished table, entirely unassuming, yet quietly altering the landscape. Returning to my ledger, I reviewed the catalogued observations from previous dinners. Each minor slight, each overconfidence, and each unguarded glance now had context. The envelope would act as a catalyst, transforming these observations into actionable leverage when the moment arrived. I noted the likely reactions. Henri reading with curiosity, Solange with polite appraisal, Aurelia remaining unaware, and perhaps a step behind in her calculations. Every move they had made until now had provided me with this opportunity. I poured a cup of tea and sat at the window, watching the afternoon sun reflect off the maple in my yard, the leaves trembling in a gentle breeze. The quiet of the house allowed me to focus, to anticipate the subtle shifts that the envelope might produce, to imagine the unspoken tension that would ripple through the room when the second dinner began. By evening, everything was set. The document was in motion, the message delivered with discretion, and the stage for the next phase of observation and strategic interaction had been prepared. The advantage of foresight rested in my hands, and all that remained was for the scene to unfold as planned. I closed my notebook and leaned back, allowing the clarity of the plan to settle. Tomorrow the dinner would begin, and every calculation, every preparation, and every note in the ledger would converge at that single table where patience and precision would finally meet opportunity. I arrived at the house just as the late afternoon light softened across Lake Otsego. The driveway, polished and pristine, reflected the care with which the Devereaux family maintained appearances, but my attention was elsewhere. I carried the documents and notes, carefully placing them in my handbag, the weight of preparation comforting. The house was quiet, the stage set, before any actors had taken their places. I let myself in and moved slowly through the rooms, observing every detail as if cataloging a scene for a performance. The chandelier hung low, catching the last rays of sunlight, casting soft prisms over the polished silver and crystal, arranged so deliberately on the dining table. The flowers, perfectly arranged, gave off a subtle fragrance that filled the room, but could not disguise the tension I already sensed beneath the surface. Each element was intended to communicate control, refinement, and expectation. I took a seat near a sideboard, allowing the space to familiarize me with its rhythms, noting the slight angle of the chairs, the symmetry of the settings, the glint of polished cutlery. It was a subtle orchestration, designed for observation and influence. My mind cataloged the scene like a chessboard, identifying points of leverage and anticipating the moves of those who would soon enter. Aurelia arrived first, her heels clicking lightly across the polished floor. She paused when she saw me, her posture fluid, her smile measured. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, something unspoken, a hint that my calm presence had unsettled her momentarily. I acknowledged her with a neutral nod, a subtle assertion of control without confrontation. She maintained her composure, though the air of certainty she usually carried was just slightly diminished. Henri and Solange followed, moving in with their accustomed elegance. Their eyes, too, registered the difference immediately. Henri's usual ease carried an edge of curiosity, a silent question as to how much I knew and how deliberately I would wield it. Solange's smile was polite, but the slight tightening at the corners suggested unease. They were aware that something had shifted, yet the magnitude remained invisible to them. The mini-twist was clear. They recognized the anomaly, the calmness I exuded, but they had no inkling of the preparations underpinning it. I let the moment linger, allowing each of them to acclimate to my presence. The subtle shift in energy, the uncertainty, the small hesitation in their gestures was all I needed. They would operate under the assumption that I was simply composed, polite, perhaps even deferential, and yet every observation, every calculated action was quietly accumulating power in my favor. Linnea arrived last, her smile warm, but carrying the faintest shadow of concern. She had noticed the slight ripple in the room, the tension that even I had orchestrated without overt movement. She gave me a brief nod, acknowledging that I had anticipated much, but she did not yet understand the full scope. I allowed her that space, knowing that the lessons she would learn tonight would be guided by observation and consequence rather than instruction. The table was set, the room quiet, except for the gentle hum of anticipation. I allowed my gaze to move over the crystal, the silver, the carefully placed flowers, letting the weight of preparedness settle into the space. Every glance, every tilt of a head, every tiny shift of posture from Aurelia or her parents was noted, catalogued, and added to the ledger forming in my mind. As the first course was served, I remained composed, taking in the interactions, the subtle exchanges, and the hints of uncertainty that my calm demeanor had already introduced. Each movement, each glance, each whispered coordination among them was now mine to interpret, mine to anticipate, and mine to use when the time came. With the scene fully arranged and the actors in place, the real work was about to begin. Every observation from this carefully orchestrated setup would feed into the strategy I had meticulously prepared. As the main course concluded, I placed my napkin carefully to the side and allowed a moment of silence to settle over the table. The room had been humming with polite conversation and subtle maneuvering, but I knew that the time had come to introduce the element that would quietly shift the balance. With calm precision, I reached into my handbag and retrieved the documents I had prepared under the name Françoise Moreau. I laid them on the table in front of me, letting the weight of the papers and their understated presentation speak before I said a single word. I thought it would be helpful to share some details regarding our involvement, I said, my voice steady and measured. The room stilled. Aurelia's eyes flickered in surprise, though she masked it immediately with a practiced smile. Henri's brow furrowed slightly, and Solange's grip on her glass tightened imperceptibly. I began presenting the key points, the extent of the investment, the structure of the holdings, and the strategic vision for the vineyard's expansion in the United States. Each document was concise, legally precise, and delivered in a tone that carried authority without arrogance. I emphasized collaboration and opportunity, never dominance, allowing the facts themselves to do the work. Aurelia's smile, carefully maintained through so many subtle manipulations, faltered. A twitch at the corner of her lips betrayed the recognition that she had underestimated not only my knowledge, but also my capacity to act decisively and strategically. Henri leaned closer to Solange, exchanging a glance that conveyed shock and disbelief. The subtle confidence they had carried throughout the evening wavered, and the quiet energy of control began to shift in the room. I continued, calmly referencing the minor but significant leverage points that had been previously unnoticed. The bridge note, the timing of minority share conversions, the potential influence of Cascade Ridge Holdings, all were revealed in an understated manner that allowed no room for argument. The room, previously alive with assured composure, now bristled with the tension of unexpected clarity. Linnea, seated beside me, watched with wide eyes, sensing the transformation in the room's dynamic. She realized without me saying a word that her mother had anticipated and prepared for every subtle move Aurelia and her parents had made. The patterns of behavior cataloged over years of observation were now manifest in decisive action. Aurelia tried to speak, but her carefully practiced words faltered, her usual control undermined by the reality laid bare in black and white. Henri, usually so composed, cleared his throat momentarily, searching for a justification or objection that could mitigate the shock. Solange's polite smile had all but vanished, replaced by the realization that their assumptions had been entirely upended. I allowed a brief pause, letting the documents and their implications settle. The room was silent, but not still. The energy had shifted from confidence to disbelief. Every glance, every micro-expression conveyed the recognition that the evening's apparent civility had been a stage, and I had quietly rewritten the script. I returned to reviewing a single page as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, letting the weight of truth hang in the air without embellishment. The subtle authority of preparation, of patience, of strategy, now spoke louder than any words could. Aurelia and her parents were left to reckon with the implications, to confront the unexpected consequence of underestimating the woman before them. With the revelation complete and the room's dynamics irrevocably altered, I prepared to continue the evening, aware that every subsequent interaction would now be measured against the reality I had quietly established. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my expression neutral, as Aurelia's smile faltered. Further, her attempts to recover lost their rhythm. The documents I had placed before them spoke with a clarity that words could not achieve. Every number, every note, every line of legal language conveyed authority, precision, and deliberate action. I said nothing more, allowing the facts themselves to demonstrate what patience, observation, and experience could accomplish. Henri leaned forward slightly, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, searching for a point of contention. Solange's eyes flicked between Aurelia and me, her composed exterior now trembling just enough to reveal uncertainty. The confidence they had carried into the room began to dissipate, replaced by the quiet realization that they had misjudged the situation entirely. They had assumed influence expected deference and imagined that the evening was still theirs to control. They had underestimated me. Aurelia's voice trembled the first time she tried to interject. I didn't realize. She paused, glancing at her parents for support, but there was none forthcoming. The documents lay before them like a mirror, reflecting the reality of their assumptions back with impartial precision. Her overconfidence, her subtle manipulations, the careful lines she had drawn to assert authority, all were undone without a word from me. I allowed a faint smile to form just enough to acknowledge the quiet victory without boasting. Linnea, sitting beside me, observed the scene with wide eyes, gradually understanding the layers of foresight and strategy I had employed. The lessons I had cataloged over decades, the discipline of patience and measured observation were now visible to her in the most direct way. She began to see the difference between reacting impulsively and responding deliberately, between the temptation of confrontation and the power of preparation. Minnie Twist Aurelia finally understood, with a sharp pang of disbelief, that she had misjudged me on every level. My knowledge of business, my grasp of French, my ability to remain calm under pressure, and my capacity to transform observation into leverage. The realization left her momentarily speechless, her carefully constructed persona faltering as she processed the scope of what she had overlooked. I sipped the wine that had been poured for me earlier, allowing the motion to fill the brief silence. No one spoke, yet the room was alive with unspoken acknowledgement. The weight of preparation of experience and of meticulous calculation now hung in the air, undeniable and inescapable. The lesson did not require drama or raised voices. It required only facts, patience, and timing. Linnea leaned slightly closer, her eyes meeting mine. She did not need words to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. The subtle interplay of observation strategy and quiet authority had revealed the true measure of the moment. I saw the shift in her perception, a recognition that wisdom often manifests not in confrontation, but in careful, deliberate action. Aurelia sat back in her chair, her posture stiff, her mind tracing the unexpected consequences that had unfolded. Henri and Solange exchanged glances, their authority diminished not by argument, but by the impartial weight of numbers and foresight. The silent lesson had been delivered with clarity that no explanation could match. I allowed the room a moment to absorb the reality, letting the power of patience and precision resonate. Every subtle gesture, every line in the ledger, every step of preparation had converged to create a situation that required no further embellishment. The stage was set, the dynamics shifted, and the evening now continued under the quiet authority I had established. With the facts laid bare and the lesson absorbed, I turned my attention to Linnea, aware that the next steps would not only reinforce the evening's revelations, but also shape the understanding and growth that would carry beyond this single dinner. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I found Linnea in the study, flipping through a ledger I had left on the desk. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. The tension from the dinner had not fully dissipated, but in that moment, a bridge of understanding began to form between us. "Mom," she said softly, "I didn't realize how much you had seen or how much you had prepared." Her voice carried no accusation, only recognition. I nodded, letting the weight of the evening settle between us. It had been a lesson in patience and observation, one that could not be hurried, one that relied on quiet presence as much as deliberate action. I gestured toward the ledger. Every slight, every assumption, every moment of arrogance, they all tell a story. Not just about them, but about how we choose to respond. Linnea leaned in, tracing the lines I had written, and I could see the wheels turning as she began to internalize the principles I had applied: patience, judgment, and dignity. A mini twist revealed itself subtly. Linnea's posture shifted, a small but unmistakable signal of quiet assertion. "I think I see where I've been letting Aurelia influence decisions without questioning her," she admitted, her tone measured, deliberate. "It's different, seeing how strategy and awareness can change the outcome without confrontation." The realization in her voice mirrored the shift I had orchestrated through observation and preparation. We spoke for a long while, discussing not the superficialities of the evening, but the deeper lessons it had offered. I explained how assumptions could be traps, how patience could create leverage, and how dignity could be maintained even when others sought to undermine it. Linnea listened, absorbing the guidance with a mixture of reverence and quiet determination. She began to see her own place within the dynamics of our family, and how subtle shifts in awareness could produce profound results. As the night deepened, I allowed her to reflect aloud, piecing together the interactions she had witnessed and the insights I shared. She recognized patterns she had once overlooked and acknowledged moments where she had deferred unnecessarily to Aurelia's manipulations. It was a quiet awakening, a recalibration of perception and agency that I had long hoped to foster. By the time we moved to the sitting room for a final cup of tea, Linnea had begun to assert herself with subtlety, correcting minor assumptions and questioning gentle suggestions from Aurelia that might have gone unchallenged before. It was a soft assertion, one that respected family bonds while also reclaiming autonomy. I observed her, my heart steady and calm, knowing that the lesson extended beyond strategy or leverage. It was about understanding the interplay between patient's perception and principle. And as we settled into a shared quiet, I knew the foundation for change, both in our relationship and in the dynamics with Aurelia, had been firmly established. With the night drawing to a close, I returned to my study, ready to review the next phase of careful action and prepare for the ongoing course that patience and precision would guide. The days following the dinner passed with a quiet rhythm that felt both deliberate and restorative. Linnea moved with a renewed sense of agency, making small but deliberate choices that reflected the lessons she had absorbed. Aurelia, for her part, carried herself differently, a subtle humility threaded through her usual poise. She remained polite and attentive, aware, now that her assumptions about me and my presence had been thoroughly challenged. I approached each interaction with the same calm precision I had applied to the dinner itself. Corrections were gentle suggestions, measured, and authority asserted not through confrontation, but through the weight of experience and the clarity of fact. Family conversations shifted. Topics once dominated by Aurelia's confident interruptions now included Linnea's considered input and, when appropriate, my own steady guidance. Aurelia tested the waters occasionally, offering opinions with that practiced smile, but I allowed her gestures to speak for themselves, choosing not to counter each one. Her subtle adjustments to her behavior revealed that she was recalibrating her approach, learning through observation that respect and competence held more sway than any attempt at control or manipulation. Linnea, quietly emboldened, began asserting herself in ways that were measured yet firm. She questioned minor suggestions, proposed alternatives, and engaged with both Aurelia and her parents on a level that was previously unthinkable. Her growth, while understated, reflected a shift in the family dynamics. Influence was no longer concentrated in one direction, and I could see the change unfolding in real time. I maintained a presence that was both observant and supportive, allowing space for adjustments without dominating or overshadowing. Graceful authority, I reminded myself, was about guiding rather than imposing, about letting lessons emerge naturally rather than forcing outcomes. The family was learning, and so was I. Each interaction a chance to reinforce the subtle recalibration that had begun at the dinner. Aurelia, now tempered by the experience, and my quiet assertion, approached discussions with a renewed care, choosing words deliberately, aware that missteps could be noticed without the need for commentary. Her demeanor had shifted, not entirely relinquished, but softened enough to allow cooperation rather than competition. In those moments, I understood that the restoration of harmony was not about erasing past actions or pretending they had never occurred. It was about creating a space where mutual recognition of capabilities and respect for boundaries could coexist. Family bonds, once strained by misunderstanding and unspoken competition, were beginning to settle into a pattern of equilibrium that was steady and sustainable. As the week progressed, the household adapted to this new rhythm. Conversations flowed with a balance of honesty and consideration. Decisions were discussed rather than dictated, and the underlying tension that had once defined interactions gave way to a subtle, steady alignment. I reflected on the transformation, quietly noting that the evening's lessons had extended beyond a single dinner. They had reshaped relationships, clarified perceptions, and instilled a sense of awareness that would guide interactions long after the immediate events had passed. With the family recalibrated and the subtle equilibrium restored, I turned my attention to the next steps in a plan that extended beyond restoration, preparing to consolidate the quiet victories and secure the outcomes I had envisioned. Weeks passed, and with each day the results of patience and careful action became evident. The vineyard investment executed through Cascade Ridge Holdings was already producing subtle but steady returns, a quiet affirmation of the strategy I had set in motion. The Devereaux family remained unaware of the full scope, and that invisibility preserved the integrity of the approach. Every calculation, every measured step had yielded fruit without drama, without confrontation, just results. At home, the family dynamics had settled into a harmonious rhythm. Linnea engaged with confidence, her subtle assertiveness becoming part of the household's new balance. Aurelia's demeanor had softened her pride, tempered by the recognition of limits she had previously ignored. Henri and Solange, too, had adapted navigating interactions with a careful awareness they had lacked before. I observed these shifts not as an external judge, but as a participant in a living process of recalibration, one guided by observation, patience, and respect. I sat one evening on the back steps, a cup of tea in hand, watching the fading light filter through the maple that Linnea had helped me plant years ago. My thoughts drifted through the chapters of my own life, the triumphs in business, the years spent navigating foreign markets, the moments when patience and discernment had prevented catastrophe. It struck me that power wielded without ethics could accomplish many things, but power guided by principle and forethought carried a satisfaction that was deeper, quieter, and more enduring. The ledger I had kept, once a record of slights and insults, had transformed into a blueprint of understanding and foresight. It had guided the interactions, preserved dignity, and shaped outcomes without ever resorting to overt confrontation. Each entry had become a lesson in patience, and each observation a tool in the careful orchestration of events. The outcomes were tangible, yet their elegance lay in their subtlety. I thought of Aurelia, not with anger or resentment, but with awareness of human limitations. She had acted within her understanding, overestimating control, underestimating experience. The lesson had been delivered quietly, imparting humility while leaving room for growth. Respect had been restored, relationships recalibrated, and the dignity of all involved maintained. I allowed myself a moment to consider the true measure of success. It was not in the numbers, nor in the power exerted over others, nor in the small satisfactions of vindication. It was in the quiet knowledge that actions had been deliberate, ethical, and effective, that patience and strategy had preserved what mattered most, that the family remained intact, even strengthened. Even as the night deepened, I remained attentive to the subtle currents in the household, observing without interference, guiding without assertion. The fruits of preparation were steady, measured, and enduring, and the harmony that had been restored now carried a resilience born of understanding and principle. With these reflections, I turned my attention toward the small details that would continue to sustain this quiet victory, knowing that the next steps would require vigilance, clarity, and the same deliberate patience that had brought me to this moment. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, and earned the culmination of weeks of careful observation and patient guidance. I sat at my desk, the ledger closed, the fountain pen resting neatly beside it. In my hand was a small brass key, polished and simple, yet heavy with symbolism. I placed it into a worn envelope, sliding it gently inside and sealing it with the faintest crease. It was a gesture that carried meaning far beyond its material presence, a token of wisdom, patience, and the selective trust I now chose to extend. Linnea appeared in the doorway, holding a notebook she had been using to draft plans of her own. Her eyes met mine, with a clarity I had not seen before, a reflection of lessons absorbed and insights earned. "Mom," she said softly. I think I understand now. Patience isn't passive. Observation isn't idle. Strategy isn't just about action. It's about timing. I nodded, acknowledging the depth of her comprehension, and allowed her a small, knowing smile. She stepped closer, carrying the quiet energy of someone ready to step into her own path. The confidence was subtle, but unmistakable, a mirror of the principles I had endeavored to instill. Linnea's steps would no longer be guided solely by the expectations of others or the manipulations that had once shaped her decisions. She had learned to read the currents, to anticipate without judgment, and to act with a combination of integrity and foresight. I handed her the notebook, encouraging her to continue charting her own path, integrating the lessons of patience perception and ethical strategy. She accepted it with care, her fingers brushing mine briefly, a quiet acknowledgement that the baton had been passed not as a burden, but as an inheritance of understanding and confidence. The brass key remained in the envelope on my desk, a silent sentinel over the trust and discretion that governed my household and my relationships. It was a reminder that access, whether to information, influence, or affection, was a privilege earned, not a right. And as I reflected on the weeks that had led to this moment, I realized that the quiet power of observation, preparation, and measured action had secured not only tangible outcomes, but the enduring integrity of my family and my own legacy. I allowed myself to think of Aurelia and her parents not with rancor, but with the clarity of consequence. Their assumptions had been tested, their strategies observed, and their overconfidence tempered. They had been reminded gently but unmistakably that patience, character, and preparation carry weight beyond performance and pride. Linnea, now standing beside me, seemed to sense the finality of the lesson, the gravity of the inheritance of insight she had received. Her eyes were bright with determination, her posture steady, and her mind attuned to the principles that would guide her own decisions. It was a quiet triumph, one that required no ceremony, no applause, only acknowledgement of the work that had been done and the continuity of understanding between us. I placed the envelope with the key into the top drawer, locking it with a measured click. It was a symbol of what mattered most: control exercised with wisdom, patience applied with precision, and trust granted deliberately. With the house settled around us and the family poised to move forward, I reflected on the truth that had guided every action. Patience, strategy, and character triumph over arrogance, manipulation, and betrayal.